Hello and welcome to episode 75 of the DX Mentor, all about signal propagation. I'm Bill, AJ8B. Between the DX Mentor Facebook page, the weekly DX column in the Ohio Section Journal, the DX section of This Week in Amateur Radio podcast, and This Week in DX weekly YouTube episodes, I've received quite a few emails over the past months about a couple of topics. One of those topics is HF propagation. I assume this is due to the discussions about the current solar cycle. When will it start significantly heading down? Will there be a second peak, etc.? If this is the first time you're joining us, welcome. We have a back catalog covering many aspects of DX in both podcast and YouTube format. Please check it out. If you like what you find, please subscribe, like, and share to be always notified about upcoming events. Another way to keep in touch and to see what we're up to is via the DX Mentor Facebook page. I will be posting about upcoming podcasts, YouTube drops, as well as other DX events, so please follow us. You can check the show notes for any of the information that we discussed today. Before we get started, as I like to do, I'd like to mention an accomplishment by one of our listeners. Well, frankly, it was me. Several weeks ago, I received the ARRL DX Trident Award 200 level. I was very honored to receive this, and I thank the ARRL for continuing to find goals for us to strive for. If you've achieved that or another goal recently, drop me a note. In this episode, we will have a detailed discussion of HF propagation. My guests are Bernie, W3UR, Frank, W3LPL, and Joe, W8GEX. Bernie's call, W3UR, is probably familiar to you as he is the editor of the How's DX column in QST and the publisher of the Daily DX and Weekly DX newsletters. Frank's call is likely familiar to you as well, as he publishes a weekly propagation report, is an avid DXer, and has one of the largest and most impressive antenna farms on the East Coast. Check out his antenna layout on QRZ.com, and that's W3LPL. Both Bernie and Frank are members of the 3,000 plus DXCC Challenge Club. In fact, they're both at the 3,100 level, which is extremely rare air. This episode is definitely aided by the use of slides, but you can learn a lot as you listen to the guests discuss the various concepts. The YouTube version will drop in 2 weeks, and you can round out what you missed the first time around. Well, without waiting any further, let's tune into our gurus and find out what they're discussing.
Bernie, W3UR, first licensed in 1977. I'm the editor of How's DX.
I thought you were licensed in 64.
Oh, that's when I was born.
But you were born here, right?
No, not quite. Editor of the Daily DX and the Weekly DX. I am a DXer at heart. I do like to occasionally operate contests, and when I do, I usually walk next door to W3LPL. Go ahead, Frank.
Well, I think you missed one thing. Aren't you involved somehow in the I am absolutely drawing the blank, the 3,000 Club, the DXCC Challenge?
Yes,
and where are you, Bernie?
Where am I? I'm in Brunswick, Maryland, in my RV.
Okay. Where are you in the chase?
I think Frank would have a better idea. I think I'm 5 ahead of Frank, but I think I'm 31.71. Is that right, Frank?
31.
I don't know, Bernie. All I know is you're ahead of me.
31.71. Well, congratulations with that.
Yes. Somewhere around there. There's still a lot to be, still a lot of possibilities. Let's put it that way. But I'm waiting for 6-meter activity.
31.76, Bernie.
See?
Gee, congratulations.
Yes, well done. And last but not least, and our main topic expert today is Frank, W3LPL. Frank, tell us about yourself a little bit.
Well, I'm a professional ham, basically. I retired from the working world after spending 45 years of electronic engineering and system engineering. But I was fortunate. I worked for a defense agency where I got to spend a lot of my time doing professional stuff, having to do with HF radio, even transmitters, a 1 megawatt transmitter for over-the-horizon radar, and all kinds of receiving antennas and even some propagation stuff. So I was lucky. I found kind of the ideal job for a ham, and I did that for 45 years, and I decided that was enough, and now I'm 24-hour day ham.
Well, boy, I can't tell you how excited I am to have you with us. A little birdie told me you're not necessarily a morning person, so I appreciate you getting up and being on with us. And Bernie's on vacation and he's checking in from his RV. So I appreciate you guys making that supreme effort. So Frankie, it's your slides, it's your show. I may interrupt from time to time to describe the slide because we do have the audio only podcast portion also, but I'd love to hear High Frequency Propagation by Frank Donovan, W3LPL.
Okay, well, nice to have an opportunity to interact with your subscribers and anyone else who happens to see this after the fact. And I'll be sure to describe these slides both in my own words as well as for those who see the online presentation. So this first slide just shows the very active sun with lots of sunspots and lots of flares. So that's where we are now in the sunspot cycle. The peak of the cycle is expected to be next year. But because of the way cycles are measured, we won't know until a year after that it's happened. So but the most important thing, and I described that in my May QST article that was just published a few days ago. The most important thing is that the bands have really come to life, starting especially early this year. 10 meters has been open to Europe and around the world almost every day since early January. And the DX contesters had a great time on all the bands, but especially 10 meters during the WPX contest that just happened, and both ARRL contests and all the others that have occurred. So lots of fun being had by HF hams, especially 10 meter operators and 6 meter operators. Bernie and I are both very avid 6 meter DXers, and 6 meters has really come to life. There's propagation into South America almost every day now, especially for those hams that are in the southern tier of US states, especially Florida, South Texas, the southern border area of Arizona and California, all the way up as far as Los Angeles. They get trans-equatorial propagation to South America just about every day. And for us that are further north in the US, we have to wait for an additional hop to occur so that we can get into it. Now, a little bit later, I'll describe that. But even us further north in the US are getting a few crumbs of propagation into South America that the folks down in the southern tier of the US leave for us. So I always recommend the new ARRL handbook that was just published a few months ago, the 100th edition. The propagation chapter in the handbook has been extensively rewritten, and it covers a lot of detail. And for those that are really interested in diving into even lower level detail, there's a comprehensive set of references at the end of that chapter that allow you to really go down the rabbit hole of propagation. The ARRL antenna handbook is also an excellent reference. You know, you can't really take advantage of propagation unless you've got antennas that work, and you just can't do any better than the antenna handbook. And what's really good about these two books for hams is that they're written by hams. Unlike a lot of the other professional stuff that's really written for scientists and engineers, these two books are written by hams for hams, and they're very readable, but they're also very, very accurate. They're extensively peer-reviewed before publication, and they're really great references. Everybody should have these on their bookshelf. So this slide illustrates the difference between solar minimum on the left and solar maximum on the right. And the big difference in the appearance of these two images, other than the color, and I'll explain that in a moment. The image on the left shows a very large dark area on the surface of the sun during solar minimum. And that is called a coronal hole. It's an area of well, let me just describe the corona. The sun's corona is basically the near-in atmosphere of the sun, and it's very, very hot. It's hotter than the more dense visible surface of the sun, but there are areas where intense magnetic fields penetrate from the sun out through its corona, and that tends to make the corona somewhat cooler, and that's why this area appears to be so black, so dark in color at the wavelength that this camera was filtered to show. And these coronal holes are massive. This is the surface of the sun, so it's millions of times bigger in area than the Earth. And you can see that this particular coronal hole at solar minimum, when this image was taken, occupies, probably in the order of 10% of the surface area of the sun. It's huge. And then looking at the other image, taking at solar maximum, and the two big differences here are, number one, you don't see any of these huge darkened areas, the coronal holes. They become smaller and less intense at solar maximum and less frequent. But the other thing you see are these very, very bright areas, and these are sunspots. And you can't see it so clearly in this image, but we'll talk about it a little bit later. Sunspots tend to occur in groups, and those are called active regions, and we'll talk about active regions a little bit later. So if there's anything that's most important to take away from this whole presentation, it's summarized right at the bottom. Solar maximum improves propagation on every band from 40 through 10 meters. But it also brings much more frequent disturbed days. So we have some really, really good days, and then we have the occasional very, very bad days. So it just comes with the territory. So you get used to turning the radio on some days and discovering that the things aren't so good. But then a few days later, the bands can be just alive with activity that you've just never experienced before.
So Frank, a lot of us will, not be able to work a contest on Friday or Saturday because all the big guns are out and you can't really compete. So a lot of times I'll wait till Sunday if there's things on that I need. But as you're saying, is the further along we go in this, that the more of a gamble that becomes.
Yeah, it does. And for contesters, it's particularly important because you never know what Sunday is going to be like. So for a DX contester, for a 48-hour contest, we always assume that Sunday is going to be worse. So we take advantage of 10 meters and 15 meters the most we possibly can, recognizing that it's always a possibility that 10 meters and to a lesser degree 15 might be significantly worse on Sunday.
Okay.
But it's you just don't know. The forecasts are pretty good, but the art of propagation forecasting is nowhere good as weather forecasting. And well, don't need to say anymore. Weather forecasting is only so good, but propagation forecasting is worse, less reliable. So this slide has some little video clips on it. And in the upper right-hand corner, that's a highly magnified little video clip of a sunspot. And sunspots are intensely magnetic, as are all of these features of the sun that we care about as hams. It's all driven by the intense magnetism in the sun. And that dark area in the center is cooler. And the actual radiation, the ionizing radiation that we care about, the radiation that opens up 6 meters, opens up 10 meters at this part of the sunspot cycle, that radiation actually does not occur from the center of the sunspot. It occurs from the regions surrounding the sunspots. And the other images here in the lower left-hand corner is a video with the camera opened up quite a lot, and it's showing the progression with time. This video covers a couple of days, and you can see how sunspots appear in groups. Normally, there's more than one, and they move across the surface of the sun from east to west. And for some odd reason, when we look at the sun, the right-hand side is west. And you ask scientists, well, why is the right-hand side when you look at the sun west? And they simply say it's always been that way. So this movement of sunspots from east to west, you can see how they move with respect to each other and how they appear in groups. And this happens to be two quite large sunspots. And the remaining image is a fixed image, not a video, and it just shows one of the largest sunspots that's ever been seen compared to the approximate size of the Earth, and you can see that it's huge. Normally, the sunspots are smaller than that, but the really big sunspots are good. They're the ones that tend to really get the higher bands open. But those active regions where those sunspots are can also cause explosive events of two types, and we'll talk about those a little bit later. So the areas near the sunspots produce ionizing radiation. That's mostly a good thing. They also produce something called coronal mass ejections, CMEs, which are explosions of billions of tons of highly energetic plasma, and that occurs from the regions near these sunspots. And they cause the most severe disturbed days near solar maximum. So when you see in propagation forecasts or discussion of disturbed propagation, a reference to an Earth-directed CME, that's a bad thing, and those are probably days you're not going to have such good success on the air. The good news is that CMEs are fairly concentrated, and the vast majority of them miss the Earth. So we're about 93 million miles from the sun. And if we could sit on the sun, look back towards the Earth, it would be this tiny, tiny little speck. And the probability of a CME from the sun actually hitting the Earth is very, very small. But when it does happen, all sorts of bad things can happen to HF propagation as well as to large conductive objects on the surface of the Earth, such as pipelines and long-distance electric power transmission lines, especially the ones that come down from Canada into the US. So CMEs can have drastic effects. One of the first observations of CME effects occurred back in the beginning of the telegraph age in the 1860s. 1850s, 1860s, and they had very long distance telegraph lines running all over the world by the 1860s. And when this very intense event occurred, it's referred to as a Carrington event after a solar astronomer, it caused such disruption that some of these telegraph stations actually caught on fire.
Wow.
And the telegraphers discovered that they could disconnect the batteries and still communicate over the telegraph lines because there was so much electricity being induced into the telegraph lines by this huge CME that the telegraph operators didn't need batteries. Let's hope we don't get to experience one of those. That was long before the age of electronics. The electron hadn't even been discovered yet. That happened in 1900. So let's hope we don't experience that. But our effects are going to be a lot worse than telegraph operators operating without batteries. And the third event, and a lot of hams have experienced these, caused by solar flares. Solar flares also originate from these active regions where sunspots are. Sort of in that left-hand video, somewhere in that whole area where all these sunspots are, called an active region. They also have explosive events of X-ray radiation, primarily X-ray radiation, other electromagnetic radiation too. But the key difference here is that CMEs are plasma. So they take usually a few days to get to the Earth, whereas X-rays are electromagnetic. And they travel from the sun to the Earth in 8 minutes. And in fact, there's no way to predict when these are going to happen with any reliability, because when we first see optically with a telescope that a flare has occurred on the sun, well, by then the effects of the X-rays have already taken place. And the big effect there is for us ham operators is that this causes the HF bands to go dead. And I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but if you ever do, and you don't know that a flare has occurred, you will wonder if your antenna has fallen down, or if your radio has failed. If the bands go that dead. For a really severe solar flare, it can last for an hour. Most of them last for a few minutes. In fact, most are so brief that a lot of hams don't even realize it's happened. But for the ones that last an hour, it's pretty dramatic. The only stations you'll hear on the bands are stations that are in your immediate local area that are not communicating via the ionosphere. It's just a surface wave. So my favorite source for information about the solar cycle is NASA. Now, NASA has a big reason to worry about this. They've got this huge program to eventually put men on Mars. And that is a dangerous thing because the trip to Mars and the period that they're on Mars is not protected from these intense solar events. So you really don't want to be trying to send people to Mars during solar maximum. Well, the good news is that they're not ready yet, but we are going to be putting astronauts on the surface of the moon in a few years, maybe 3 or 4 years. So there'll still be some solar maximum activity, but perhaps by the time they get ready to send the astronauts to Mars, it might be more like 2031 when the solar cycle is at solar minimum and all of these bad effects are not very frequent. So the website is shown there, nasa.gov/MSFC solar, and they update this forecast once a month. The one I happen to have on the screen here was from the 10th of January, but I looked at the one from March and it's exactly the same. This is the sunspot number forecast. And the pessimistic one, which is shown as the 5 percentile one, which means a 5% chance that it'll be correct. It shows that we've already reached solar maximum. And the 50 percentile one, which is half likelihood of being wrong, half right, it's probably the most likely one, and it shows solar maximum occurring in the middle of next year. And then if you're really an optimist, maybe we'll have a solar cycle that's so intense that we'll have 6-meter propagation very frequently, especially from November through February. So you have to pick your optimism level and decide if you want the red line, the green line, or the blue line. I really like the blue line, but I'm not that optimistic, so I'll go with the green line. And this is the same data. And this is the one I prefer to use. This is solar flux, which is the daily measurement taken in Canada, a place called Penticton in British Columbia, where they measure the solar radiation at 10.7 centimeters of 2,800 megahertz. So they've done this every day since 1947. The nice thing about this measure is that it is a direct measure of radiation from the sun. Sunspot numbers take some interpretation. Astronomers have to look at the sun, make decisions about which sunspots to count. Some of them are really small. and they have to track that every day. And it's easier for astronomers and physicists to measure the 2800 megahertz solar flux, that just means radiation, every day, because it doesn't matter whether it's cloudy or not. All they have to do is keep the instrument very well calibrated so that the measurements are repeatable. This particular graph shows a few more percentiles, so you can vary the amount of optimism you have. I'm going to ignore the red line. That's the 5 percentile one. I'm hoping that one is really wrong. The 50 percentile one, so 50% probability it's too high, 50% probability it's too low. That shows the solar maximum occurring next year with a solar flux around 150. And that seems to be maybe a little bit lower than we've been experiencing for the last couple of months. And then the 75th percentile one is maybe tracking a little bit closer to what we've seen this year, with a solar flux reaching up above 160, perhaps 170 by next year. And if you're the really optimistic type, then maybe solar flux up approaching 200, which would be really, really good news for 6-meter DXers. Good news is for 10-meter DXers or HF DXers, any numbers above about 120 or so are sufficient to really get 10 meters rolling. And of course, the bigger the numbers, the better. The openings tend to be more reliable and more long-lasting with larger solar flux numbers, but anything bigger than 120 is good news. So if you look, if you're a 10-meter DXer, for example, for any of these NASA prediction curves, they show that 10 meters should be pretty good for about the next 4 years. So we've got about 4 years of great propagation ahead of us. So along with the beneficial effects of the solar cycle, we also get geomagnetic effects. And there are daily measurements made of geomagnetic activity. This is caused by this particle radiation. And during solar maximum, it's primarily from CMEs, coronal mass ejections. And these are the bad days. So you can see that along with the benefits of the solar cycle, as we get up towards solar maximum in 2024, conditions are getting worse from a geomagnetic point of view, which means those bad days. So those bad days are getting to be more frequent. But notice something interesting here. Recall that solar maximum is likely to be during 2024, but look at this peak. It's 4 years later, 2028 or so. So one of the oddities of the solar cycle is that these disturbances become somewhat more frequent as we get to solar maximum, but then the disturbed part, the bad days of propagation become more frequent and more severe during the next 4 years after solar maximum. And I'll explain the reason for that a little bit later. And I'm not going to devote a lot of time to these slides. This particular slide shows all of the solar cycles since the very beginning, solar cycle 1, all laid on top of each other. And the big dark black line shows the progress of our solar cycle. So you can see solar cycle 25 is kind of a middling solar cycle compared to the some of the much more powerful solar cycles we've had. But, you know, some hams mentioned to me occasionally, well, wouldn't it be great if we could have a big solar cycle like solar cycle 19, which reached its peak in late 1956 and 1957. But then I remind them, you know, to be fair, if you want to experience solar cycle 19, we also have to use the kind of equipment that we would use back in solar cycle 19. So that would mean for most of us, unless we had very, very deep pockets with a lot of gold in them, most of us would have things like Heathkit DX100s and Holocrafters SX100s or Hammerland HQ129Xs. And maybe if we were lucky, we might have had a 3-element beam on a 30-foot mast. So that's how hams experienced solar cycle 19 back in 1957. And to be fair, that's how we'd have to experience it too. So we'd have to go out and get all this old equipment and struggle. And believe me, our experiences would be nothing like we have with this fairly moderate cycle with all of our modern equipment, a much better understanding of propagation, all of the internet resources we have for DX spotting and real-time reporting of propagation conditions. And oh, by the way, for the fans, also FT8 and the other digital modes. So I think we're in the golden age of propagation now, not back like it was in 1957 with our DX100s and HQ129Xs. And this is just a little expanded, but this is kind of obsolete now, this old forecast, because now we're pretty much at solar maximum right now, or will be within a year. So this slide shows how DX propagation improves near solar maximum. And this period near solar maximum extends for about 4 years. So through about 2027, more or less. And all the bands improve except for 160 and 80. And 160 is especially degraded, but all the bands from 40 meters and up are better. Most of that benefit occurs from October through May. And I'll just briefly describe the reason for that. The part of the ionosphere that we use as DXers on HF is called the F2 region. It's at a very high altitude, about 400 kilometers above the Earth, actually anything from about 250 kilometers to 400 kilometers. So that's about 200 miles to 300 miles above the Earth. And the atomic structures at that altitude that are ionized by this intense ionizing radiation are mostly oxygen atoms. The heavier atoms and molecules are at lower levels. They're pulled down to the lower levels by gravity. So these relatively light oxygen atoms are at very high altitudes, and that's what gets ionized. And the propagation that occurs of interest to us as DXers is reflections from all of the electrons that are freed from oxygen atoms at this high altitude, 200 to 300 miles above the surface of the Earth. Well, an interesting thing happens in the summer, and that is there's a lot of high altitude wind in the atmosphere. You know, the winds don't end just down here at the lower levels of the atmosphere where we live. Winds extend all the way up to very high altitudes. And the winds in the upper ionosphere tend to blow these atomic atoms primarily to the winter side of the ionosphere. So all of these relatively light oxygen atoms that get ionized tend to be on the winter side. And the heavier atomic structures that don't ionize as easily and that also lose their ionization more quickly, they tend to be on the summer side of the ionosphere. So what does all this mean? You don't have to remember all these details. except that there's a scientific explanation for it, which is probably correct. The most important thing to remember is, from a DXer's point of view, on the 10-meter band and also the 12-meter band, the primary benefits of the solar cycle occur not in the summer. They occur from October through May. So that's when you expect 10 meters to be open pretty much worldwide, is from October through May. So here we are in April, and we're going to discover that 10 meters starts to become less reliable as we go through this month, but especially in May. And the reason is that those light oxygen atoms that provide the source of ionization at those high levels, they tend to be on the winter side of the Earth. So down at the southern hemisphere in our summer. So during the day, the primary bands that really benefit during the day, during the top of solar cycle, are the bands from 17 meters to 10 meters. I'll talk about 6 meters separately. So those of you who are interested, especially in 6, I'll talk about that in a little bit. So 17 through 10 are the primary daylight and evening bands, and they are really incredible during solar maximum, except on these occasional disturbed days. And then at night, for those of you who are active during the solar minimum period, both 30 and 20 meters tend to go pretty much dead during the night during solar minimum. But now those bands tend to be open all night long throughout the year. So if you're a 30 meter and a 20 meter DXer, those bands are especially good at night. So if you're used to not listening on those bands at night because your normal experience had been that they're dead, well, not anymore. They're really quite good. And 40 meters is a much more reliable DX band now during solar maximum than it was up until last year. So the two disturbances that occur, I already mentioned, and that is geomagnetic storms. The strong to severe ones tend to start becoming pretty common at solar maximum. So they're getting to be more common now, but they'll be even more common after next year. And then these sudden ionospheric disturbances that come from solar flares that occur without warning. But the good news is that they usually last only an hour or two, and then everything returns to normal. Geomagnetic storms tend to have effects that last for a good part of the day and sometimes for several days.
Wow.
Okay, so let me just click through these. I'm not going to go through them one at a time. So this illustration shows the F2 region in the upper right-hand corner at a daytime height of about 400 kilometers. That's about 300 miles. And that's the band of primary interest to us as DXers. The F2 region is highly variable. And it's variable by time of day, by season of the year, by whether geomagnetic storms are present or not, and also during the 4 phases of the solar cycle. We're just about at solar maximum now, probably next year. So if we're a HFDXer, essentially all of the benefits of solar maximum are already there. And most of the negative side, the disturbances haven't yet started to occur very frequently. That'll start next year. So we're kind of at the sweet spot of most of the benefits of the solar cycle right now, and not very many of the negative aspects. As we get past solar maximum, we'll start to get more and more of the negative aspects, the disturbed days. So if you look at the normal progression of propagation on 10 meters, for example, on any particular day near solar maximum, usually the band is dead until sunrise. And then depending on the amount of ionization and any disturbances that might have happened. 10 meters can open either very suddenly, right around sunrise, even occasionally a little bit before. And then in the period of an hour or two, the band is wide open to Europe, to Africa, to South Asia, up into Western Siberia. Long path, I'll discuss long path a little bit later, but pointing towards South Africa and Brazil. You at solar maximum very often discover you can work stations in Japan and Indonesia and Southeast Asia by pointing the wrong way. By the long path over South America and South Africa. And that's a very common occurrence every morning on 10 meters. And I write about that a little bit in my QST article in May QST.
And Frank, I remember when I was in college, we were at a peak of a different sunspot cycle, and we used to convert CB radios to 10 meters. And I can remember going up and down I-75 talking to Australia and Japan and Europe. And so when 10 is really good, it's really good. And you don't need a lot of power at that point.
Oh, well, it sounds like you wrote my QST article.
Oh,
In my QST article this month, well, May, is it's a careful balance of information of interest to veteran DXers, but also for new hands. And it emphasizes that at this part of the solar cycle, you don't really need high power and big antennas. In fact, if you have a basic station, maybe a typical 100-watt transceiver and a 10-meter dipole, 20 or 30 feet high, you can have a lot of fun on 10 meters every day. You don't have to have big antennas. I'm not arguing against those companies that sell those very fine products, but they're not essential. At solar minimum, you really needed a really good station to have a reliable DXing capability. But at this part of the sunspot cycle, any basic single sideband transceiver, whether it's a brand new one or a used one, and a 16 feet of wire strung between two trees, and you're a DXer working the world. This part of the solar cycle. So I vote. Then during the course of the day, so we were talking about morning when 10 meters is wide open to the northeast and the east and the southeast. As the day goes on, propagation tends to follow the sun. So in the afternoon, the band begins to open about mid-afternoon to Hawaii and the South Pacific. And then as the day goes later, strong signals start to appear from Japan and Australia and continue right on for a few hours after sunset. So that's a typical really good day on 10 meters. And let's take a look at nighttime. So what happens at night? You know, that we talk about ionizing radiation, but what happens when the Earth is facing away from the sun? Well, the good news is that at these very high altitudes where the F2 region is, and at night, the F2 region drops down to about 300 kilometers. So that's about 200 miles above the Earth. The F region is a very, very thin atmosphere. And in fact, no one has ever discovered how to make a vacuum on Earth, let's say for a laboratory or for a vacuum tube, we remember those things. No one has ever figured out how to make a vacuum as good as it is in the F2 part of the ionosphere. But there are still oxygen atoms up there and other molecules as well. We care mostly about the oxygen ones. So it's almost a perfect vacuum, but not quite. So there's still all these electrons up there, but there's so few of these atoms that the free electrons, and it's the electrons that support propagation, not the ions. The ions are too heavy to be excited by radio signals, but electrons are extremely light, and they can get energized by radiation. So we care about the electrons, and they persist throughout the night, 365 days a year. So the F2 region never goes dead. And the reason is that it's such a good vacuum that these electrons, most of them, don't find an atom or a molecule to recombine with. So these electrons survive, but they drift to a lower altitude. So they drift down to about 200 miles rather than up at about 300 miles like they do during the day. So that's the reason that the lower bands continue to support propagation during the night. 10 meters goes dead, 12 meters goes dead, 15 meters goes dead for most of the night. Oh, I'm sorry, for part of the night. On some really good nights, 15 can be open even at midnight. But eventually it goes dead. But 20 tends to stay open all night long. And 40 very definitely stays open all night long at this part of the sunspot cycle. And the reason is because these electrons didn't find an atom to recombine with, and they continued to be up there at the F2 region. Even though the sun is not there, the electrons persist. So let's talk about disturbed propagation a little bit. The sun is a star, and like all stars, it's a gas star. It's not it doesn't have a hard surface like many of the planets. Earth is the one we know best. So it's a gas star, and it rotates, but it doesn't rotate at the same velocity. So it rotates more rapidly about every 25 days at the solar equator. And most of the effects that we care about are the effects on the sun that affect the Earth. And that runs between the equator and about the mid-latitude area, where the rotation period is about 27 days. So it's a little bit slower. So what's important about this is that severe solar effects tend to repeat on the 27-day interval. And the most reliable of those repetitive events are those coronal holes. And let me just go back to that slide and emphasize, because I don't have an image here, but I'll go back to this slide. So on the left side, you can see one of those coronal holes. And you can see that it extends across almost the entire surface of the sun. So as the sun rotates, this very large coronal hole will occur 27 days later. And very, very, very large coronal holes like this one can persist for as much as 4 rotations around the sun, or 4 months. Most of them either don't recur at all or recur twice, but there's some of the really, really big ones like this one can last up to 4 times. So let's go back to where 4 rotations. So here we are at the nighttime F2. So it's the fact that our sun is a gaseous star, and most of the Earth-directed effects from the sun occur at low to mid latitudes, and 27 days is the rotation period that tends to occur for these coronal holes. Coronal holes, by the way, occur most frequently between solar maximum and as we approach solar minimum. And I'll go back to this other slide just to illustrate that. You may remember this slide where the geomagnetic the disturbed geomagnetic conditions occur not so much at solar maximum in 2024, they occur increasingly frequent over the first 4 years after solar maximum. And the reason for that is that coronal holes become a dominant feature of the sun during that period after solar maximum. So they start to occur most frequently right after solar maximum, and they become more and more frequent for about 4 years, and then gradually become less frequent until we get to solar minimum. So that's what causes, for the most part, that 27-day recurrence. And that will become very, very apparent after next year. Okay, so 6-meter DXers, this is the time to pay attention. I was reviewing the questions for the extra class exam a few years ago, and I was startled to see a question with the wrong answer, and it didn't have the right answer. And the question had to do with ionization. Where is on the surface of the Earth, or in space above the Earth, so a few hundred miles above the surface of the Earth, where would you expect to see the most ionization? Would it be directly below the sun? Or would it be at mid-latitudes? Or would it be in the polar region? And you know, most people think about this, and if they haven't been exposed to some of the science of the ionosphere, would think, well, the most ionization must be right below the sun, where the sun is radiating directly on the Earth. So anybody that's ever been to Africa or Northern Australia or Brazil knows that it's a whole lot more solar radiation there than we have up here in the northern part of the United States. So you would think, well, the most ionization must occur near the subsolar point, so near the equator. But unfortunately, that answer is wrong. That's not at all what happens. There's another annoying aspect of this complicated science of propagation, and that is that the Earth's magnetic field has a strong influence on propagation, and this is one of the strongest influences. I think anybody who's ever used a compass knows that when you use a compass, certainly everywhere in the United States, you have to, if you want to know true north rather than magnetic north, you have to offset the reading of your compass, depending on where you are, maybe 7 degrees or more. And the reason for that is that the magnetic North Pole is not in the same location as the geographic North Pole, in other words, the axis of the Earth. So for that reason, the geomagnetic equator is not the same as the geographic equator, it's offset. So in the Western Hemisphere, the geomagnetic equator sits about 1,000 miles south of the geographic equator. So it runs through Brazil rather than through Ecuador. So why does that matter? Well, in the F2 region that we're interested in as DXers, the Earth's magnetic field passes through the F2 region, and it has an influence on the electrons up there. And it also causes a very intense electric field at low altitudes in the E region. And what happens is it creates a force, and before scientists understood this, they referred to it as the equatorial anomaly, which they didn't understand the cause. So it was referred to as equatorial anomaly. And what that causes is for the electrons that are freed up through the ionization process, instead of them sitting directly above the geomagnetic equator, they get pushed up to high latitudes and then they precipitate back down, primarily from gravity, and they wind up enhancing the ionization roughly for this part of the world over Venezuela and Bolivia. And for us here in the United States, we care mostly about the enhancement of the F2 region over Venezuela. So that question in the extra class question pool has been revised. And now the extra class people have to know that the maximum ionization is not over the equator, or the geomagnetic equator more accurately. It's not there at all. It's about 1,500 kilometers north and south of the equator. And this name has this kind of a funny name to this process, and it's called the electron fountain, because the electrons that you would expect to occur at the geomagnetic equator instead get pushed up very high in the ionosphere and then precipitate down. They follow magnetic field lines, and they precipitate down along those lines. They're pushed back down to the earth by gravity, and they enhance this area over Venezuela. And I'll show a map a little bit later that shows that. So these two areas of enhanced ionization are called the ionization crests, the northern crest and the southern crest. Where we are, we care mostly about the northern crest. That's what allows this propagation to occur. It tends to begin in the late morning and reaches its maximum intensity in the middle of the afternoon, and then continues throughout the early evening and sometimes a little bit later into the night. And this allows us on 6 meters, and this has already happened, even though we're not at solar maximum, almost every day on 6 meters now, we can work into South America. Even from the more northerly areas of the United States, we get a brief period. But if you happen to live in South Florida, especially south of Miami, or in South Texas, you get this propagation just about every day at this part of the sunspot cycle, and for many hours if you're in the very southern part of the U.S.
So Joe, you were shaking your head. Is that what you've been experiencing recently?
Yes. I'm up in Ohio, north of Cincinnati, Frank, and we've been getting South American every day, pretty much.
On
Pretty
6
much
meters.
every day, right? But you get it for an hour or two every day for the most part. And if you look on PSK Reporter or DX Maps, and our buddies down in Florida get this propagation for about 6 hours a day. And we get it on a good day, we get it for 3 or 4 hours. And on a day like yesterday, we get it on and off for an hour or two here and there. Right? Is that what you experience?
Yes, yes, for sure.
So the extent of this direct propagation from the ionization crest over Venezuela, that propagation extends directly on almost all days, only about as far north as Florida and South Texas. So we need another hop of some type. And the most likely hop is on 6 meters is from sporadic E. But we can also get the occasional F2 brief benefit as well. But we need an extra hop of some type, either E or F. But we are about to get to the time of year, April, May, June, July, when sporadic E is very, very common. So, Joe, you're going to discover now that these openings that occur every day for maybe an hour or two to South America from Ohio, they're now going to start lasting for many hours on days when you have a sporadic E cloud. But remember, the operative term is sporadic. So some days you got it and some days you don't.
So you've run into this too then, right, Bernie?
Yeah, or sometimes the guys further north, if you get it.
Yeah, it's the operative term is sporadic, all in capital letters.
Yeah.
You can't predict when this is going to happen. And let's hope it's not on the day when the DX country you really, really, really want to work is working your buddies up in Maine, and in Ohio or Maryland, we're just waiting and waiting, and it doesn't happen. Sporadic is the operative term. But if we get lucky, you remember those NOAA charts that showed how how this, if you're very, very optimistic, the solar flux might get up to be around 200. If that happens, it's not looking very likely right now, but if it does happen, then we may be able to use much more reliable F2 hops into this type of propagation. You know, F2 hops, once you get solar flux up around 200 or higher on 6 meters, F2 becomes more available to us, and these openings might become more reliable, longer lasting at our mid-latitude locations in the US. But anyway, we get this propagation every day now, even in the more northern part of the US. It just doesn't last as long. But you know, I've been working stations in Argentina and Chile just about every day for the last month or more. And they've been there since January. But it's going to get really good during May, when the sporadic E is much more common than it is right now, much more intense than it is right now. And the geomagnetic equator will be pointing directly at the sun in May. So everything is kind of optimum in May. So 6 meters can be really great in May for propagation crossing into South America. And by the way, there's another, this form of propagation also supports a much less reliable mode for us at higher latitudes that allows us to work into the South Pacific and Australia and New Zealand. And if you look on PSK Reporter or DX Maps, you can see that our friends down in South Florida and the southern part of Arizona and around San Diego, they're working this same mode of propagation into the South Pacific, New Zealand, and Australia almost every day now. But we have to be really, really, really lucky to get into this mode of propagation. And Bernie, I think you've seen it, just a couple of days this year, is that right?
Yes.
And not long enough to make a QSO, isn't that correct?
It did work the FK. I did work the FK.
Work the FK. So you had one QSO by this mode, but our buddies in South Florida have had dozens of QSOs. And if they wanted to work the same guy day after day after day, they could. So this mode of propagation has a funny name. It's called oblique TEP. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that the normal TEP that we work into South America runs pretty much perpendicular to the geomagnetic equator. But the propagation into the South Pacific VK and ZL runs almost parallel to the geomagnetic equator. So the name that's been given to that form of propagation is oblique TEP, tends to be within about 20 degrees plus or minus of running parallel to the geomagnetic equator. It's very, very common into the South Pacific, Australia, and New Zealand at this time of year, but only if you live in South Florida and South Arizona and around San Diego. There's another path using oblique TEP to the east, and that path tends to be over Central Africa, and that provides occasional propagation, but unfortunately mostly from Florida and the Caribbean into Central Africa, the Indian Ocean, and even long path propagation in the morning to Japan and Southeast Asia. And Bernie and I have a good friend, N3OC, who lives about 10 miles south of us. And he's been working long path on 6 meters into Indonesia and Japan very frequently. But our friend 10 miles from us has a remote station in Antigua.
Hector too.
Good for him.
So this is the 21st century, you know, where we have the internet. And if you have a place in Antigua or your other favorite island in the Caribbean, 6 meters is a totally different band down there, totally different. And the reason is this chart and this ionization crest that sits over Venezuela. In Africa, it sits over West Africa. It's actually a continuous band, covers about half the Earth, the daylight side of the Earth. So if you have a remote station in the Caribbean, you can work long path on 6 meters occasionally, not every day, occasionally. You can work into Central Africa like TR8CA or 3C3CA, or in the Indian Ocean like 3B9FR or 3B8FA. You can work those stations almost every day if you have a remote station in the Caribbean, but not up here. You have to be really, really lucky. Bernie and I were lucky last year to work TR8CA on the one day that this occurred. And Bernie, I think did you hear 3B9FR a couple of months ago?
Yeah, 2 months ago. He heard me, but we couldn't put it together.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough up here. Bernie, you need to build your remote station down in Antigua. Maybe you can bring your bus down there.
Yeah.
There you go.
So next year you can get on here from your bus in Antigua.
Okay.
Maybe you need a submarine. Okay. Enough of that. So I'll just briefly mention some of the bands. For HFDXers, 10 and 12 meters are the two bands that have had the most dramatic improvement. But we're not going to see most of that improvement from about the middle of May through the middle of September. 10 meters will calm down quite a bit. And the openings we will have on 10 meters during the summer will be mostly to South America, using the TEP mode I just showed you that we use on 6. And then for the more northern hemisphere propagation like to Europe, that's actually going to be sporadic E, just like on 6 meters. 15 and 17 meters, there's enough ionization in the summer that those bands are still pretty reliable. So they become pretty good DX bands throughout the year, not as badly affected during the summer as 10 meters and 12 meters are. So if you're a 10 and 12 meter DXer, it's a good time to get your 15 and 17 meter antennas all polished up and ready to go. So what about long path? If you're not a DXer, you might wonder why sometimes I point my antenna directly at Japan and the station I was listening to fades away. And then if I turn it the wrong way, signals are stronger. Well, long path propagation tends to follow pretty closely along the terminator. The terminator is the area between sun lit parts of the Earth and darkness. So this map is typical of the location of the terminator during the winter months. So you can see in this case, if you follow the terminator, it's almost the perfect path between the east coast of the United States and Japan. So that, and there's a big population in Japan, which is perhaps the biggest factor of all. So this propagation is very commonly observed, especially on 40 meters at night, because there's a big population in the perfect place, Japan. There's a lot of ham activity there. And the propagation follows an area where the ionization is almost the same. So the amount of ionization from the sun is almost exactly the same following this terminator area. Because the ionization is much greater when you get away from the terminator. But right at the terminator, the ionospheric conditions are similar, not the same, but similar all along that long path. And signals can be really strong on that long path, surprisingly so. And at this part of the solar cycle, we get long path propagation from the eastern part of the United States to Japan pretty much throughout the year on the higher bands. It tends to occur on the higher bands, it tends to occur in the morning from shortly after sunrise until about 3 or 4 hours later. And we've had long path propagation to Japan on 10 meters very frequently ever since the sunspot cycle started really heating up late last year. So this is the path that it follows typically over the far eastern end of Brazil, and then skirting Antarctica up over the western part of Australia, and then to Asia. So the big difference on 20 meters is how much better it is at night. It's really become a very reliable nighttime DX band now at this part of the sunspot cycle. Unfortunately, during the summer, 20 meters becomes a pretty difficult daytime band. The ionization of the E region, which is much lower, is pretty intense during the summer, and most of the propagation on 20 meters during the day winds up being a fairly short distance propagation. So from Ohio, in the middle of the day on 20 meters, you've got great propagation into New England and into Florida and into the Mississippi Delta, but not so much to Europe and not so much to the South Pacific during the day. And that's just because the E region is so intensely ionized that signals reflect from it before they can ever get up to the high altitude F2 region. So 20 is not a great daytime band in the summer. It's quite good during the winter. And it's during the entire year, it's a really great DX band at night. And this was what I was just talking about. That phenomenon is called blanketing. And the blanketing is actually mostly from the E region. And in the summer, it's also sporadic E. Sporadic E that benefits us so much on 6 meters, and that the field day operators, they really like it because it lets them work all these near-in stations on 20 during the day, but it also prevents DXers from working long distances on 20 meters in the summer during the day. So what bands do you want to use during the next 4 years? Well, during the daytime, you really want to focus on the bands 17 meters and above, and especially 10 meters. 10 meters is great because there's almost no absorption. So you don't really need high power. You don't really need big antennas on 10 because there's almost no absorption. And as a lot of people have observed, if the band is open and you're on the air, you can probably work just about anything. And if you're not working just about anything, it's probably because you're snoozing. It's not because you couldn't, but you just weren't there. You know, what do they say? 90% of success is showing up. And that applies on 10 meters or for any DXer. You have to be there. Okay, there's another region of the ionosphere called the F1 region that mainly is another degradation of 20 meters during the day in the summer. But it turns out that the really, really serious problems on 20 meters are from the E region. So 20 meters during the day, not so great, unless you want to work your buddy in Florida. And There's another, the lowest region of the ionosphere is called the D region. Let me just go back to the previous slide where it shows that map. So there's a map showing the ionosphere. The lowest region is the D region. On the HF bands, that's entirely an absorbing region. There's no propagation from that region. It's all absorption, and it affects primarily the lower bands, 160, 80, 60 meters and 40 meters. To a lesser degree, 30 meters. So it's an absorbing area. And during the sunspot maximum period where we are now, that absorption is somewhat increased. So during solar minimum, many of us who operate on the 40-meter band during DX contests, for example, we were used to being able to work European stations on 40 meters as early as 2 o'clock in the afternoon. But now with a lot more ionizing radiation from the sun, those mid-afternoon openings are not as good as they used to be a few years ago during solar minimum. But it's a pretty good trade-off between losing a few hours of 40-meter afternoon propagation versus the incredible propagation we get on the higher bands. So I'll take that trade-off. And 80 meters is significantly worse than it used to be. And that's caused mostly by residual ionization of the E region at much lower altitudes. So while during solar minimum, 80 meters would often come to life right at sunset, at this part of the solar cycle, we often have to wait a few hours after sunset before the band really gets good, when this residual ionization of the E region finally fades away. And 160 meters, well, if you're a 160 meter DXer, you really, really, really need to be patient. The good openings do occur, especially during the winter. But boy, you've got to be vigilant. And we have a local ham in this area who is vigilant. He lives about 5 miles from Bernie and I. And he was on 160 meters at sunrise a couple of months ago. And he worked not only one, but he worked 2 countries on 160 that neither Bernie or I have ever worked.
Really?
Really? Bernie, where
You were
was that
sleeping.
one?
You
Well, at
gotta
least
get
one
up,
of us was. The other one was working.
you gotta get up early, Bernie.
That's
I
right.
was up. I was working.
I was sleeping and Bernie was working.
And they were 2 good ones.
And
X,
boy,
XV, Vietnam, and followed by YB,
wow.
Indonesia.
Both very, very rare on
On the East
160 in
Coast.
this part
Very
of the
rare.
US. And our
Boy, did
friend
he-
Jack worked both of them. And
Did he enjoy that call to you guys, huh?
well, he didn't even call us because the opening was so short.
No, he called me. He called
did
me,
he?
but I didn't
Not
have
only
any
to tell you
info.
that the opening was already done.
It's done, quick, done and gone.
Hey, Bernie, there was something I meant to tell you an hour ago, Bernie, and it slipped my mind. I don't know what it was. Oh, yeah, Vietnam was workable on 160.
You know,
Holy cow.
Bernie and I frequently go to lunch with this local ham, and we can tell jokes just by if we say BY, we laugh, and the reason is that this local ham who's always on the air at sunrise, he worked the station in China, and I slept through it, and Bernie worked through it. So we can tell jokes just by saying BY or Bravo Victor, right, Bernie? You know what that one is.
That's the fun part of it, is the chase.
That's
Absolutely.
right. So there's a story behind
At least
all
we have
of
something
those.
to look forward to working still, Frank.
That's right.
Something.
Look at the positive side. But we'll probably sleep. I'll sleep through it again next time. Okay. So 160 meters. This is a specialist band now. You just got to be there every sunrise, and once in a blue moon, you'll have a big smile on your face, and the rest of the time, not so much. So, Bill, let me know when you want to cut this off. We've been going now for what, an hour and 20 minutes. So if you want to cut it off, just let me know.
All right. Uh, since I'm not sure what you have coming up.
But we've covered most of the material.
Okay, all right.
Would it be interesting for 6 meters, or sure, or are we running out of time, Bill?
For 6 or 60?
6.
6.
What about 6?
Yeah, so it turns out I've covered most of the material already when I talked about the TEP propagation and those enhanced ionization areas, especially over Venezuela. So, Joe, is there any particular question you want me to address?
I need to work
Regarding 6?
Australia bad.
On 6 though, right?
On 6. I
Excuse
got
me.
New Zealand a couple of times, Frank, but man, I sure would like to work Australia.
Well, Bernie and I worked Australia last summer, and it's 6 meters is often referred to as the magic band, right? You
Yes.
just gotta be there. And one day in July, last summer, there was a big opening from Maryland, and it was very localized to VK4. And it was using this oblique TEP with some sporadic E across the United States. So it's very likely that although Bernie and I were lucky to work a few VK4s that day, in Ohio, you may not have had that opening at all.
Yeah, we were on the phone when that happened, and Frank and I were talking, and I believe he said, "Hey, there's a station in Virginia down around Tidewater that is spotting a on the PSK reporter a VK4," and sure enough, not 60 seconds later, I decoded him.
Yep.
And then Frank decoded them, and we both worked 3 of them all within a half hour, and they were solid signals. I mean, solid signals for a half hour, and then gone.
Wow.
Yeah.
So
You never know.
Frank, is it true that you have a cable that runs over to Bernie's antenna farm? And
I'll never say.
oh, so I'll tell you the question I have, and it's been driven by something that years ago we had something called the W3LPL convention, and Bernie was kind enough to join us, and we also had Carl K9LA, and Carl had just published an article about FT8 propagation. Is it a new propagation mode? And he wasn't, I don't think he was basically saying that it changed the law of physics, but it is interesting that maybe there really are some low noise paths that don't exist, or just you simply can't detect with other modes. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are as to why. I mean, is FT8 simply as successful it is because it is low noise, or is there something different about a whole low noise technology?
Bill, here's my opinion, and Bernie may have a little different opinion. In my opinion, it's all about activity. FT8 has revitalized the 6 meter band, so now we have thousands of hams all over the world who were never particularly interested in 6 meters, and especially all the effort it takes to find these occasional openings. So right now, all of these things are coming together. So we've got the sensitivity of FT8, which is a few dB better than CW, a few dB, not a lot, a few, but it's useful. But we've got things like PSK Reporter and DX Maps. So we're aware of worldwide propagation all the time. We never had that. And we have all this activity. And of course, now we've got Solar Maximum that opens 6 meters essentially every day for DXing. And we had that in the other Solar Maximums, but we didn't have all this activity, and we didn't have PSK Reporter, and we didn't have DX Maps, so we were not aware of it. Now our awareness is much better. The activity is dramatically increased, and now we have sunspots.
Okay.
So I have a question real quick, Frank, and then I'll be done. On your day-to-day activity, because I'm looking at all my screens and that and my radio equipment, and so day-to-day activity, what do you really watch for propagation on any band, 6 meters or 10 meters, whatever? What's your main propagation source?
Mostly it's the internet. So for 6 meters, PSK Reporter is what I use.
Okay.
I also use some tools that alert me to when, so I don't have to have my eyes glued to the screen. So I use tools that alert me to openings.
Okay.
And there's a number of those. Bernie has a favorite one. Bernie, what's the one that you use that alerts you to openings?
JT Alert. There's another one called Spots. It's written for blind hams. And I'm also using on my cell phone Ham Alert. And Ham Alert, at least for me, is really, really good because it tells me what the local guys are hearing, like Frank and Jack and Brian. When all of a sudden they hear a JA or something on a certain band, this alert goes off and says, hey, something's happening. So that's between all of that. And I would also add that there's so many radios now that have 6 meters. There's so much activity. We have the internet. Propagation is really good. It's just a combination of all of that and being ready to pounce on the DX when it's your opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a factor I neglected to mention is now almost every ham has a radio that covers 6 meters. Almost everybody.
Yep.
And that wasn't the case until this solar cycle.
So any DXpeditioners that are listening, take a 6 meter antenna because your radio has it. And that should be the first or second antenna you put up.
Yep.
Yeah. When I go to the Bahamas in the summer, it's unbelievable. I just use a dipole, 6 meter dipole, and I work around the world on it. Japan is just barreling that. But of course, a lot of it's got to do with propagation. I'm on the salt water and so forth. But I use JT Alert. Oh my God, I absolutely love that because I can be anywhere in the house and or in bed as far as that goes and get my JT Alert. I'm pretty old and pretty slow, but I can move when that alert goes off.
So Jody, is there anybody else in your household that might be experiencing these alerts?
Yes, she loves it.
In fact, Frank, he uses a bugle sound on his JT Alert. So sometimes Janet will go out to the car when they're ready to go shopping and she'll make the bugle sound and he'll come running.
I got 2 hearing aids, Frank, and when I go to bed, take them off at night, I don't hear very good at all. So I've got a baby monitor from my granddaughter. She's grown now. So I put that monitor next to my radio and the other end, the receiver in my bedroom, and then it monitors that trumpet sound. And when that trumpet sound goes off, I'm on the road.
So Bernie, are you going to give that a try in your bedroom?
No.
Yeah, I do that pretty frequent on any band.
You know, one thing though, with all this going on, sometimes I find myself getting lazy and I only rely on all that. And every once in a while, it's a good feeling to find a dead band and call CQ. And I'm like with CW, and I'm shocked. It's like, boy, the band's actually open. I didn't hear anybody. And what's the old adage? Why is the band only open on contest weekends, right? So there's no substitute for getting on and calling CQ either, in spite of all the spots and everything else you see. You know, sometimes I gotta be honest, I use a lot of information from Bernie and say, okay, AP2AM has been showing up like last night on 20 meters out of the blue for about 20 minutes and he's gone. And if you do a little homework, sometimes all this other information's terrific, but it doesn't beat, butt in the chair and ear on the radio sometimes as well. So I think it's a combination of all this stuff that really makes it fun and exciting.
So when I get Bernie's bulletin every morning, I put a Post-it note on my calendar. to where W3LPL is going to be in Alaska. And so my whole calendar is full of them posting notes. And then every day I put those out on my desk and see if I can work that guy. So your bulletin, Bernie, oh my God, it's a lifesaver to me. I recommend it to everybody. And that's a paid commercial too. I forgot to tell
Thank you, Joe.
Don't agree.
So Bill, I suggest we close this out. Just a few other slides that I've got here, and I'll just
Okay.
and then we can just close it out in probably in 5 minutes. Is that
Okay.
This slide shows occurrences of coronal mass ejections. These are these really severe causes of strong geomagnetic storms, and you can see how the occurrence of CMEs peaks around solar maximum and then slowly declines through a couple of years after solar maximum, and then at solar minimum, CMEs become very uncommon.
So
And
can
this is
you go can you go back one?
Yeah.
So as I look at this, if I think that let's just say 2024 is our next peak, and we're on an 11-year cycle, that would make 2013 the previous peak, just in general numbers.
Yes, that's right.
And it's interesting then that the peak of the CMEs is a good year and a half after that, just like you said.
Yeah.
So it's
Yep.
that is really interesting.
Right, and this is actual data. So the reason this doesn't go through 2023, 2024 is this is actually, these are actual numbers from the last cycle, but every cycle is similar.
Okay.
So these CMEs are a big problem near solar maximum, and much less frequently after a few years afterwards. And here's another real complicated slide. The only thing I want to focus your attention on is that these things called fast CMEs, these are very high velocity, so they're the strongest CMEs. They're faster than 700 kilometers per second. What did he say? 700 kilometers per second is the speed at which these fast CMEs move. They can get to Earth in less than a day. And these are the ones that cause really bad problems on the HF bands, that can cause power outages on these long distance power lines from Canada. They can actually destroy equipment. They set telegraph stations on fire back in the 19th century. It's the fast CMEs we worry about. And if you look at the bottom of this slide, you can see that they are the dominant cause of all sizes of geomagnetic storms during solar maximum.
Very interesting.
The other causes are much less severe. If you just briefly look at the top of the slide, that's near solar minimum, and you can see the fast CMEs are not as big a factor. And if you look at the right side, the severe storms are about 3 times more common. That's near solar minimum, and the strong storms are about twice as common near solar maximum. So it's the fast CMEs that cause the problems during the solar maximum period. And let's see. This is the K index. I think most dams are familiar with this. During solar maximum, what we really worry about is the stuff shown in red, K index of 6 and stronger. But I will mention something interesting, since Joe is so interested in 6 meters. And that is, if you're an HF DXer, you think about geomagnetic storms as being a bad thing, but they actually enhance TEP on 6 meters. And we had some pretty high K indexes about 2 weeks ago, something like that. And the guys in Florida were working TEP all through the night. And it was a geomagnetic storm that wiped out the HF bands, but really enhanced TEP.
Oh.
So, and our friend N3OC with his station in Antigua, 6 meters was open all night long, and he was working long path into Japan. It's incredible, and it was all caused by a strong storm. So it can be great for 6 meters. It's kind of counterintuitive, but it enhances the ionization down in those areas called the equatorial ionization anomalies. The word anomaly comes from back in the 1950s when scientists didn't understand what the heck was going on down there. I'm not going to get into these details, but I want to show a couple more charts here. This is a chart that shows days per year of geomagnetic storms. And again, you can see the storms occur much more often near solar maximum. And we've been lucky during the recent solar cycles. On this chart, the extreme storms are shown in the dark color. And you can see during the last solar cycle, we had none of these extreme storms in the last cycle. And it's possible we won't have one in this cycle either. But they're uncommon events. The last one we had was more than 20 years ago.
Wow.
And this is another chart that shows the likelihood every day during the entire solar cycle, the likelihood every day that the K index will exceed a certain value. And if you're active on the bands and you follow the K index, you know that typically you see K indices of 2 or 3. There aren't many days when it's 0. And thankfully, there are very few days when it's 6, 7, or 8. But the good news is at this part of the solar cycle, we've got so much ionization that when the K index is 4 or 5, it's not too terrible. We don't start to have real serious problems at this part of the solar cycle until the K index gets to be 6 or higher. And then 6 meters can be really enhanced when that happens. And this is another interesting chart that shows the variability throughout the year. And we're at the time of year when geomagnetic disturbances are about twice as often, occur about twice as often as they do during June and July. And this shows actual measurements. What's going on here is that the orientation of the Earth is tilted. About 23, I'm sorry, about 8 degrees. The axis of the Earth is tilted. So during March and April, the axis of the Earth is oriented so that in these months, the likelihood of radiation from the sun, geomagnetic radiation from the sun, so the coronal holes and CMEs, they have the biggest effect on the Earth when the Earth's axis is kind of perpendicular to the sun. And June and July, even at solar maximum, we get fewer geomagnetic disturbances. The probability is lower, but that does not mean that we won't get severe occurrences in June and July, just that they're about half as frequent as they are now. But just as a word of caution, one of the strongest geomagnetic disturbances that occurred during the 20th century happened during June. So they don't happen as often, but they can still be pretty severe. So this is probability of occurrence, not strength.
Wow.
And this is another chart that shows the actual variability of the K index versus month of the year and time, where blue is low K indices and dark red is high K indices. So you can see the seasonal effect where the blue is much more dominant in June and July, especially during the early morning. And the red, the very disturbed periods, are much more likely during April and October than they are in June and July. So these are actual measurements. This is not forecasting. And this is yet another way to look at this seasonal variability, the occurrence of geomagnetic storms. And again, you can see they're much more common during March, April, and September, October than they are in June and July, and especially December. Just another little factoid that's kind of interesting You know, if anybody's followed the news over the last few years, you may have noticed this occasional news item about how the magnetic pole has been drifting away from northern Canada. And in fact, it's not far from Siberia now. But that has nothing to do. Let me repeat that again. It has absolutely nothing to do with propagation. The magnetic pole is defined to be the place where compass needles point vertically. So it only has to do with compass needles. So if you're a 18th century navigator, you care about this. But you know, now we use things like GPS. We don't care about compasses. And what we care about as ham operators is the Earth's magnetic field in space, where it passes through the ionosphere. And the good news is that the pole for the geomagnetic field hasn't moved hardly at all. It's still up between Greenland, the very northern part of Greenland, and Canada. So ignore all this news reporting you see about the magnetic pole moving, because that only has to do with compass needles and not propagation. Not propagation. And that's, let's see, I think. Oh, this is an image of the X-28 flare that occurred in November of 2003. Pretty incredible. You could just shut off your radio that day. And for the next couple of days. Those are very rare events. Notice it occurred in November. So at the time of year when these events are pretty common. These solar flares are categorized in terms of C class, M class, and X class. X class is the ones we really worry about. X stands for extreme. And you can see this is actual data, so it doesn't go into the current solar cycle. You can see the last solar cycle was relatively weak, so we didn't have as many of these really strong ones. Well, let's hope we never see an X20 class. That would be definitely a day you don't want to be on the air. And this is my very last slide. Bill, I think it was you that was mentioning that sometimes you get on the air when the bands are totally dead and you're surprised that there actually is propagation. Well, there's a way to tell if you get on the air on a dead band. There's a way to tell if you're being heard. You don't have to wait for somebody to call you. There's a website called reversebeacon.net where you can get on the air on your favorite CW or radio teletype mode and call CQ a couple times, and then you can go to this website and see where you were heard. This is a very, very easy website to use. Experiment with it. Like so many things on the web, you can't break it. So you can play with it and see what's going on. So this is helpful so you can know what propagation is present, but you can also determine if you're being heard. So Bill, that's my last slide.
Well, I believe there's guys using that for testing different antennas too, right?
It's very difficult to do that though, but yes, you can do it, but it requires extraordinary patience.
Okay.
Because the ionosphere is so variable. It's extremely variable, so you have to make hundreds of measurements to have any sort of confidence at all that that you're correct.
Okay. The one question I had jumps to mind for Joe. Joe, do you remember the event in the 1880s there where the telegraph offices caught on fire? And
Yes, I was very scary.
And you know, Bill, these, a lot of these newspapers are online now, so you can go online and crawl into a rabbit hole and learn about this stuff now.
Yeah.
You just do a search for telegraph office fires, and you can read the New York Times reporting about these telegraph offices that caught fire in the 1860s.
Well, I can remember putting something in our newsletter about the Carrington event. I don't think it was to that detail, but it was really interesting. So, well, as we like to do, Joe, do you have any wrap-up questions or comments?
No, thank you very much, Frank and Bernie, for participating today. been very, very interesting. So thanks a million.
Bernie?
I would just say, I'm glad that Frank was able to do this wonderful presentation. Thank you, Frank.
You're
Yeah,
welcome.
Frank, I can't tell you how much I was so pleased when you responded and said you could make it, and absolutely fascinating stuff. You know, it's that part of the hobby that I don't think people appreciate. You know, all the work you do, all the physics involved, all the stuff that you can take the time to learn and understand if you want and actually test it. So I really appreciate what you've done and you're sharing your time with us and your accomplishments as well.
And don't forget, as hams, we've got these two wonderful publications available to us for those that want to learn a lot more. The new 100th edition ARRL handbook has a completely rewritten propagation chapter, and the antenna book has everything you could possibly want to know about antennas. So these are both wonderful resources available to us. And anybody that's looked at the 1950s versions of these two books, they're absolutely no comparison to what is available to us now.
Wow. As well as your article in Make UST.
Yep, that's only 3 pages. That's a whole lot less reading than these two books.
Well, that's interesting. Well, guys, again, thank you so much for your time, and I'll get this out here. I'm sure you'll get a lot of questions that I'll forward you this way, and if there's ever anything I can do to help you, please contact me. But I guess at this point we'll sign off, and I'll say thanks to you all.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, 73.
7-3.
Bye-bye.
I hope you found that as interesting and informative as I did, and I hope that it answered many of your questions about propagation and what you can expect at different times of the year from different bands. Thank you for joining us on this edition of the DX Mentor. I would like to thank our sponsors, ICOM America, the Daily DX, DX Engineering, and the Southwest Ohio DX Association. You won't find anyone more committed to DX than these sponsors. I would also like to thank our guests today, Frank, W3LPL, Bernie, W3UR, and Joe, W8GEX. I would love to have your feedback, answer your questions, and provide help with any DX or amateur radio issues that you may have. If you need clarification on something or you just have a question, email me at thedxmentor@gmail.com. I would especially like to thank you, our listeners and viewers. Without you, there would be no reason to do this. Please drop me a line if you've achieved an all-time new one, received recognition, or have a DX event that you would like us to mention. We would be happy to do that. If you're enjoying these DX Mentor episodes, please hit the subscribe button. If you want to follow us to get updates on future YouTube and podcast episodes, as well as DX events and DXpeditions, join the DX Mentor Facebook group. 7-3 for this episode, and thanks to my XYL Karen for her love and support. I hope to see you in the pileups.